The courtroom buzzed with the entitled confidence of money and power. Ricardo Briggs sat flanked by his high-priced legal team, a calculated smile spreading across his face as he prepared to dismantle his wife's life piece by piece. He thought she was just a devoted housewife from a modest Southside family, completely outmatched in his world of wealth and influence. He thought winning would be a formality, a performance for the court record. He was catastrophically wrong. The moment Betty Briggs checked her phone at exactly 2:15 p.m., and the courtroom doors began to creak open, everything shifted. Ricardo wasn't just divorcing a quiet woman in a red dress. He was about to face a reckoning orchestrated by people who specialized in bringing down men exactly like him. And today they had come with evidence he thought he'd buried forever. The divorce proceedings of Briggs versus Briggs were unfolding in the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago, a building that reeked of leather-bound law books and broken promises. To Ricardo Briggs, the smell was intoxicating. It smelled like vindication, like freedom, like the beginning of his next chapter. Ricardo straightened his slate-blue checkered suit jacket, catching the glint of his $15,000 Patek Philippe watch in the afternoon light filtering through the courtroom windows. He was an impressive man in the way predators are impressive, polished, commanding, and completely devoid of conscience. At 42, he was a senior vice president at Whitmore Capital Management, an investment firm where he'd climbed the ranks through a combination of genuine talent and ruthless ambition. He'd built his reputation, admittedly on the foundation his wife had laid during their lean years, but he'd conveniently erased that chapter from his personal narrative today. He wasn't thinking about how Betty had worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA at Kellogg. He wasn't thinking about the way she'd kept their household running during the 80-hour weeks that earned him his first promotion. He was thinking about Vanessa Cole, his 29-year-old executive assistant, currently booking a celebratory weekend in Napa Valley, and he was thinking about how satisfying it felt to discard the people who'd outlived their usefulness. "Look at her," Ricardo murmured to his lead attorney, Carson Mitchell. Mitchell was a man renowned in Chicago legal circles as the closer, because he didn't simply win divorce cases. He obliterated the opposition, leaving them with nothing but debt and humiliation. "She actually thinks that public defender is going to save her. This'll be wrapped up by 4 p.m. Carson Mitchell smirked, the expression sharp and predatory. "Textbook execution, Ricardo. We paint her as a financial burden who contributed nothing measurable to your success. She signs the settlement accepting minimal spousal support for 2 years, agrees to the NDA, and walks away grateful we didn't pursue a countersuit for emotional damages. She's got a public defender going up against me, a public defender. It's almost unsportsmanlike." Across the aisle, Betty Briggs sat in composed solitude. She wore a vibrant red dress that stood out against the muted courtroom like a deliberate flag of defiance, her natural hair styled in elegant waves that framed her face. She looked serene, almost meditative, but anyone watching closely would have noticed the tension in her hands as she reviewed documents with her young, clearly overwhelmed public defender. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, and her eyes periodically flicked to her phone resting on the table beside a thin stack of papers. Judge Gerald Robertson presided over the proceedings with the casual authority of a man who'd decided the outcome before opening arguments. His slight nods toward Ricardo's table, the barely concealed impatience when Betty's attorney attempted to object, it all telegraphed which way this case was meant to go. Betty glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall. 2:12 p.m. Her phone sat face down on the table, silent for now. She took a slow breath, her fingers interlacing as Carson Mitchell stood to deliver his opening statement. The show was about to begin, and Ricardo Briggs had no idea he was the one being set up for the fall. Carson Mitchell rose from his chair with the theatrical precision of a man who'd perfected his performance over 2 decades of high-stakes litigation. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, took 3 measured steps toward the center of the courtroom, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the smooth menace of sharpened steel wrapped in velvet. "Your Honor, what we have before us today is not a complex case. It's a simple story of entitlement, of a woman who married success and now believes she's entitled to half of what she never earned." He turned, gesturing toward Betty with the casual dismissiveness one might use when pointing out trash on the sidewalk. "Mrs. Briggs, or should I say Miss Harrison, since she seems eager to return to her maiden name, spent 10 years as what she calls a homemaker. Let me translate that for the court. She spent 10 years doing nothing measurable, nothing quantifiable, nothing that contributed to the substantial wealth my client accumulated through his own exceptional talent and relentless work ethic." Judge Robertson leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Carson Mitchell warmed to his theme, pacing now, his movements calculated for maximum impact. "The evidence will show that Mrs. Briggs has no college degree, no professional credentials, no employment history to speak of since her marriage. While my client was building a career at one of Chicago's most prestigious investment firms, working 80, sometimes 90-hour weeks, what was Mrs. Briggs doing? attending charity luncheons, shopping on Michigan Avenue, living a life of comfort entirely subsidized by my client's labor. Betty's public defender, a young woman named Alicia Chen, who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days, half rose from her chair. Your Honor, this is Miss Chen. You'll have your opportunity for opening statements. Judge Robertson cut her off with a wave of his hand, his tone carrying the boredom of a man who'd already made up his mind. Continue, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you, Your Honor. Carson's smile sharpened. Mrs. Briggs now claims she supported my client during his education. Let's examine that claim. She worked retail jobs, minimum wage positions that barely covered groceries, while my client secured student loans based on his own merit. She claims she, quote, managed the household. Your Honor, my client's tax returns show he paid for a cleaning service, a meal delivery service, and professional home management. What exactly was Mrs. Briggs managing? Ricardo leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating satisfaction. In the gallery, a court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype. 2 journalists in the back row scribbled notes. Carson Mitchell turned to face Betty directly, his voice dropping to a register that somehow made the cruelty more intimate. What Mrs. Briggs wants is a reward for mediocrity. She wants to be compensated for simply existing in proximity to success. The evidence will show financial irresponsibility, lack of contribution, and a pattern of dependence that my client can no longer sustain. Betty's expression remained steady, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes stayed locked on Carson Mitchell, unblinking, as if memorizing every word for future reference. Judge Robertson nodded slowly, his pen making notes that seemed entirely performative. Quite thorough, Mr. Mitchell. Betty's phone vibrated once against the table. 2:14 p.m. The screen lit up briefly with a simple message. Outside. Something shifted in Betty's posture. It was subtle. The straightening of her spine, the slight lift of her chin, the way her hands moved from flat and defensive to clasped and purposeful. The woman who'd been sitting in composed endurance began to transform into something else entirely. Her eyes, which had been downcast and patient, now lifted to meet Judge Robertson's gaze with unsettling directness. Carson Mitchell was still talking, building toward his crescendo about financial irresponsibility and unearned privilege. But Betty was no longer listening. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that centers and prepares. Her right hand moved to smooth down the fabric of her red dress, a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. Alicia noticed the change immediately. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Betty turned to her young attorney and smiled. Not the tight, nervous smile she'd worn all morning, but something genuine and almost apologetic. "You did your best with an impossible situation. Thank you for that." "What do you mean, did?" "We're not." The courtroom doors swung open with authority, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carson Mitchell's voice died mid-sentence, as every head turned toward the entrance. What walked through those doors wasn't just interruption. It was inevitability. Marcus Harrison entered first, and the effect was immediate. He was a distinguished black man in his mid-60s, with silver hair that caught the light like burnished steel, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that made Carson Mitchell's expensive ensemble look pedestrian. But it wasn't the clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he moved, with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd walked into hostile courtrooms for 40 years and walked out victorious every single time. His reputation preceded him like a shockwave. 2 of the journalists in the back row sat up straighter, recognition dawning on their faces. One whispered urgently into her phone. Behind Marcus came a federal investigator, her FBI badge prominently displayed on her belt, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. She carried herself with the alert stillness of someone trained to assess threats in milliseconds. Next to her, a forensic accountant in wire-rimmed glasses balanced 3 banker's boxes, stacked with meticulous precision, each labeled with evidence tags that caught the fluorescent lights. And finally, bringing up the rear, came David Harrison, Betty's younger brother, 32 years old, lean and intense, carrying a laptop bag and a tablet, his eyes already scanning the courtroom with the systematic focus of a cybersecurity expert cataloging vulnerabilities. Judge Robertson's expression transformed from irritation to confusion, to something approaching dread as recognition hit him. His pen clattered onto his desk. "Mr. Harrison?" His voice came out uncertain, stripped of its earlier casual authority. Ricardo Briggs had gone completely still, his confident posture collapsing like someone had cut his strings. The expensive watch on his wrist suddenly looked like evidence rather than status symbol. He leaned toward Carson Mitchell, whispering urgently, his face draining of color. "Who the hell is that?" Carson Mitchell's jaw had tightened, his theatrical confidence evaporating. He knew exactly who Marcus Harrison was. Everyone who practiced law in Chicago knew. Former federal prosecutor. Civil rights attorney. The man who'd brought down 3 Fortune 500 executives for financial crimes in the last decade alone. The man who didn't take cases unless he knew he'd win. Marcus Harrison walked directly to Betty's table, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He placed one hand gently on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about protection, pride, and long-planned vindication. Betty looked up at him, and for the first time that afternoon she smiled. Not nervously, not tentatively. She smiled like someone who'd been holding their breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. "Your Honor," Marcus Harrison's voice filled the courtroom with the resonance of absolute authority. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Marcus Harrison, and I'm here to serve as counsel for the defendant, Mrs. Elizabeth Briggs. I believe we have some evidence the court needs to see." Judge Robertson cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control over a courtroom that had suddenly shifted beneath his feet like unstable ground. "Mr. Harrison, this is highly irregular. Proceedings are already underway, and Mrs. Briggs is represented by counsel." Marcus Harrison's smile was polite, patient, and utterly immovable. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my daughter has the right to choose her representation at any point in these proceedings. Ms. Chen has done admirable work under impossible circumstances, but I believe the complexity of what we're about to present requires specialized expertise." He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a folder, walking it directly to the bench with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "My credentials and bar certifications, Your Honor. I'm licensed to practice in Illinois, New York, and federal court. I've also taken the liberty of notifying the U.S. Attorney's Office of my appearance here today." The words U.S. Attorney's Office landed like a grenade with the pin pulled. Ricardo's head snapped toward Carson Mitchell, his whisper now frantic and barely controlled. "What is he talking about? What the hell is happening?" Carson Mitchell's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of a man rapidly calculating exit strategies. He stood slowly. "Your Honor, I object to this theater. Mr. Harrison is clearly attempting to intimidate these proceedings with federal overreach." "I'm attempting nothing of the sort," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his tone remaining courteous but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "I'm simply introducing evidence that bears directly on the division of marital assets. Evidence that my client has been gathering for approximately 2 years with the assistance of professionals." He gestured toward the federal investigator and forensic accountant, who had positioned themselves strategically near the plaintiff's table. "Evidence that reveals Mr. Ricardo Briggs has been systematically laundering money through offshore accounts, falsifying tax returns, and conducting financial fraud that, I'm afraid, makes this divorce proceeding the least of his legal concerns." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The journalists were typing furiously. Judge Robertson's face had gone from confident to cornered, his eyes darting between Marcus Harrison and Ricardo Briggs like a man watching his career flash before his eyes. Ricardo stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is insane. This is, Your Honor, this is a harassment campaign. My wife's father is making wild accusations to—" "Sit down, Mr. Briggs," Marcus Harrison said quietly, and something in his voice made Ricardo obey instinctively, sinking back into his chair as if his knees had given out. Marcus turned back to the judge, his expression shifting from polite to predatory. "Your Honor, I have a USB drive containing encrypted communications, bank transfer records, and recorded conversations that I believe the court, and the federal authorities standing in this room, will find extremely illuminating. I move to introduce this evidence immediately, and I suspect once you've reviewed even a fraction of it, you'll agree that these proceedings need to take a very different direction." Judge Robertson looked at the FBI investigator, who nodded once, her expression professionally neutral but her presence speaking volumes. He swallowed hard. "Motion granted. Let's see what you have, Mr. Harrison." David Harrison moved with the efficient precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. He connected his laptop to the courtroom's display system, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced ease. The large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, casting a pale glow across the suddenly silent room. Ricardo's breathing had become audible, quick and shallow, like a trapped animal sensing the walls closing in. The first image appeared on the screen, a text message exchange, the metadata timestamp clearly visible in the corner. David's voice was calm, almost clinical as he narrated. "These are encrypted messages recovered from Mr. Briggs's secondary phone, the one registered under his executive assistant's name. Date, March 15th, 2 years ago." He highlighted a specific exchange. "Here, Mr. Briggs writes to Vanessa Cole, moving $400K to the Georgetown account tomorrow. Betty's too busy planning her mother's birthday to notice. She still thinks I'm working late." Carson Mitchell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, the provenance of these messages is questionable at best. This could be fabricated." The FBI's cybercrimes unit verified the digital signatures and metadata, the federal investigator interjected, her voice cutting through Mitchell's objection like a scalpel. "These messages are authentic, counselor. We've known about them for 6 months." David clicked to the next slide. Bank statements filled the screen, transaction after transaction highlighted in yellow. Between January 2022 and August 2024, Mr. Briggs transferred approximately $4.7 million to accounts in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and a shell corporation in Luxembourg registered under the name Whitmore Holdings LLC. He zoomed in on one particularly damning transfer. This transaction, $850,000, occurred 3 days before Mr. Briggs filed his tax return, declaring an annual income of $380,000. Judge Robertson leaned forward, his earlier bias completely evaporated, replaced by the hard scrutiny of a man realizing he'd nearly become complicit in federal crimes. Mr. Mitchell, does your client wish to address these discrepancies? Ricardo's face had gone gray, sweat beading at his temples, despite the courtroom's air conditioning. He grabbed Carson Mitchell's arm, pulling him down for a whispered conference that looked more like begging than strategy. David continued, merciless in his presentation. The next slide showed forged tax returns, side-by-side comparisons between what Ricardo had filed with the IRS and what his actual bank statements revealed. Then came invoices from shell corporations, companies that existed only on paper, billing Whitmore Capital Management for services never rendered, the money disappearing into offshore accounts within hours. This invoice, David said, his laser pointer circling a document dated 6 months ago, claims payment for, quote, consulting services from a company called Meridian Advisory Group. That company has no employees, no office, and no business license. It exists solely to funnel money that Mr. Briggs then splits between his offshore accounts and cash payments to his mistress. He paused, letting that sink in. We have 2 years of this. Every transaction documented, verified, and cross-referenced. The forensic accountant stepped forward, placing the first of 3 boxes on the defense table, with a heavy thud that seemed to echo Ricardo's collapsing future. Carson Mitchell had recovered some of his composure, though his performance now carried the desperate edge of a man trying to bail water from a sinking ship. Your Honor, circumstantial financial records don't prove criminal intent. Mr. Briggs is a sophisticated investor. Offshore accounts are perfectly legal when properly disclosed, and any discrepancies can be explained through. Would you like to hear from someone who helped him create those discrepancies? Marcus Harrison's question hung in the air like a blade. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small digital recorder, holding it up for the court to see. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording made 3 weeks ago during a proffer agreement between federal investigators and Ms. Vanessa Cole, Mr. Briggs's executive assistant, and as the evidence clearly shows, his romantic partner. Ricardo's face transformed from gray to white, his hands gripping the table edge so hard his knuckles went bloodless. No, he whispered. She wouldn't. We had an agreement. Marcus pressed play. The courtroom speakers crackled briefly, then Vanessa Cole's voice filled the space, young, educated, and trembling with barely controlled fear. My name is Vanessa Marie Cole. I'm providing this testimony voluntarily in exchange for immunity from prosecution. A pause. The sound of someone taking a steadying breath. I've been involved in a romantic relationship with Ricardo Briggs for approximately 18 months. During that time, he asked me to help him move money between accounts to avoid detection by his wife and the IRS. The federal investigator's voice came through the recording, calm and professional. Can you describe the nature of this assistance? He had me set up shell companies using my name and social security number. Meridian Advisory Group, Georgetown Holdings, 3 others. He said it was just for tax purposes, that everyone in finance did it, that it was legal. Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. But then he started talking about moving money before the divorce, about making sure Betty couldn't find it. He said she was stupid, that she'd never think to look. That's when I realized I wasn't helping with tax strategy. I was helping him commit fraud. Carson Mitchell was on his feet again, his voice rising. Your Honor, this woman clearly has motivation to lie. She's facing charges herself and... Carson Mitchell had recovered some of his composure, though his performance now carried the desperate edge of a man trying to bail water from a sinking ship. Your Honor, circumstantial financial records don't prove criminal intent. Mr. Briggs is a sophisticated investor. Offshore accounts are perfectly legal when properly disclosed, and any discrepancies can be explained through. Would you like to hear from someone who helped him create those discrepancies? Marcus Harrison's question hung in the air like a blade. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small digital recorder, holding it up for the court to see. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording made 3 weeks ago during a proffer agreement between federal investigators and Ms. Vanessa Cole, Mr. Briggs's executive assistant, and as the evidence clearly shows, his romantic partner. Ricardo's face transformed from gray to white, his hands gripping the table edge so hard his knuckles went bloodless. No, he whispered. She wouldn't. We had an agreement. Marcus pressed play. The courtroom speakers crackled briefly, then Vanessa Cole's voice filled the space, young, educated, and trembling with barely controlled fear. My name is Vanessa Marie Cole. I'm providing this testimony voluntarily in exchange for immunity from prosecution. A pause. the sound of someone taking a steadying breath. I've been involved in a romantic relationship with Ricardo Briggs for approximately 18 months. During that time, he asked me to help him move money between accounts to avoid detection by his wife and the IRS. The federal investigator's voice came through the recording, calm and professional. Can you describe the nature of this assistance? He had me set up shell companies using my name and social security number. Meridian Advisory Group, Georgetown Holdings, 3 others. He said it was just for tax purposes, that everyone in finance did it, that it was legal. Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. But then he started talking about moving money before the divorce, about making sure Betty couldn't find it. He said she was stupid, that she'd never think to look. That's when I realized I wasn't helping with tax strategy. I was helping him commit fraud. Carson Mitchell was on his feet again, his voice rising. Your Honor, this woman clearly has motivation to lie. She's facing charges herself and... Marcus stopped the recording. Miss Cole isn't facing charges, Counselor. She has full immunity because she came forward voluntarily 6 months ago when she realized the severity of what she'd been involved in. The U.S. Attorney's Office found her testimony credible, detailed, and corroborated by the physical evidence we've presented today. He let that settle, then pressed play again. Vanessa's voice returned, quieter now, almost confessional. He told me we'd go to Napa this weekend to celebrate the divorce. He said Betty would sign whatever we put in front of her, because she was too intimidated to fight. He laughed about it. About how she'd be left with nothing while we lived off money he'd hidden. A long pause. I couldn't be part of that anymore. I couldn't watch him destroy someone who never did anything wrong except trust him. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Ricardo sat frozen, his entire world visible, crumbling behind his eyes. In the gallery, one of the journalists stood abruptly, phone already at her ear, rushing toward the exit to file the story that would be breaking news within the hour. Judge Gerald Robertson sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his hands flat on the bench, his face a carefully controlled mask that couldn't quite hide the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was a man watching his reputation balance on a razor's edge, realizing with cold clarity how close he'd come to becoming a footnote in a federal prosecution. The judge who'd been so obviously biased that he'd nearly helped a criminal strip his victim of everything she had. The journalists were still in the room. The federal investigator was watching him with professional interest. Every word he said from this moment forward would be scrutinized, quoted, potentially used as evidence of judicial misconduct if he didn't choose very, very carefully. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all its casual authority, replaced by something formal and cautious. The court has reviewed the evidence presented by counsel for the defendant, and I find it both compelling and deeply disturbing. He looked directly at Ricardo, and there was no warmth there now, no subtle favoritism. Mr. Briggs, I am denying all motions filed by your counsel effective immediately. Any requests for asset division, spousal support limitations, or settlement agreements are hereby suspended, pending criminal investigation. Carson Mitchell opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it, sinking back into his chair with the defeated posture of a man already composing his withdrawal from the case. Judge Robertson continued, his gaze shifting to the federal investigator. I am ordering an immediate freeze on all assets belonging to Mr. Ricardo Briggs, including but not limited to bank accounts, investment portfolios, real property, and any holdings in corporate entities where he maintains ownership or control. The U.S. Marshal's Office will enforce this order within the hour. He scribbled notes with quick, sharp movements, as if speed could somehow distance him from his earlier mistakes. Then he did something that rarely happened in courtrooms. Something that made the remaining journalists lean forward, sensing the significance. Judge Robertson removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Betty Briggs, who sat with her father's hand still resting protectively on her shoulder. Mrs. Briggs, I owe you an apology. The words seemed to physically pain him, but he forced them out. My apparent bias during these proceedings was inappropriate and unbefitting this court. You came here seeking justice, and I failed to provide you with the impartial hearing you deserved. Whatever my personal assumptions about this case may have been, they had no place influencing my conduct on the bench. Betty met his gaze steadily, saying nothing, her silence more powerful than any acceptance could have been. Judge Robertson turned back to Ricardo, his voice hardening. Mr. Briggs, given the severity of the evidence presented and the presence of federal law enforcement, I am remanding you to custody pending arraignment on charges to be filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Bailiff, please coordinate with the federal authorities present. He brought his gavel down once, the sound sharp and final. These proceedings are suspended indefinitely, pending resolution of criminal charges. We are adjourned. The gavel's echo seemed to hang in the air as Ricardo Briggs's carefully constructed world finished its collapse. 2 federal marshals entered through the side door, with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd executed this choreography countless times. They wore dark suits that marked them as distinctly different from regular bailiffs, and they moved with the calm authority of people who dealt with white-collar criminals every day, men who thought their money and connections made them untouchable, right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. Ricardo stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward, his eyes wild with the dawning realization that this wasn't theater, wasn't negotiable, wasn't something his lawyer could fix with the right motion or the right judge. Wait, I have rights. I need to make a phone call. Carson, tell them I need. Carson Mitchell was already backing away from the plaintiff's table, his expensive leather briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield. Your Honor, for the record, I had absolutely no knowledge of any criminal activity. My representation of Mr. Briggs was based solely on the information he provided regarding marital asset division. I will be filing a motion to withdraw as counsel immediately. The words came out fast, practiced, the legal equivalent of someone yelling "not it" before being tagged. He didn't even look at Ricardo as he spoke, his eyes fixed on Judge Robertson, as if seeking absolution. You son of a... Ricardo started, but one of the marshals was already beside him, professional and inexorable. Mr. Briggs, please place your hands behind your back. The marshal's voice was conversational, almost bored, the tone of someone who'd said these words so many times they'd become pure reflex. Ricardo fumbled for his phone instead, his fingers shaking as he tried to unlock it. I need to call. I have people who can fix this. I have. The screen lit up briefly, then went completely black. Not dead battery black. Remotely deactivated black. Ricardo stared at it in disbelief, pressing the power button repeatedly like somehow that would undo a federal warrant. My phone. They killed my phone. How did they? Part of the investigation, Mr. Briggs, the FBI investigator said from where she stood near the evidence boxes. Your electronic communications have been under surveillance for 6 months. Your phone, your laptop, your tablet, all deactivated as of 10 minutes ago to prevent destruction of evidence or witness tampering. She said it matter-of-factly, without malice, just stating information he should have already understood. The marshal's patience had limits. He gently but firmly took Ricardo's wrist and guided his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet courtroom. Ricardo's $15,000 Patek Philippe watch caught the light one final time as his wrists were secured, the irony of the moment not lost on anyone watching. A man who'd measured his worth in expensive accessories, now being measured by the federal sentencing guidelines for financial fraud. Ricardo Briggs, you're being taken into federal custody pending arraignment. You have the right to remain silent. The marshal continued through the Miranda rights as they guided him toward the door, his slate blue checkered suit, that had looked so commanding an hour ago now just looking expensive and futile. 6 months had passed since the courtroom doors opened and changed everything. The news cycle had feasted on the story for weeks. Investment banker's divorce becomes federal case. Wife's family takes down fraudulent husband. The divorce that ended in handcuffs before moving on to the next scandal. But for Betty Briggs, or Betty Harrison as she'd legally returned to being called, those 6 months had been about reconstruction, about reclaiming a life that had been on hold for a decade. Ricardo was serving 15 years at a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, his appeals exhausted, his reputation demolished beyond any possibility of recovery. The courts had been merciless in sentencing, perhaps influenced by the recordings of him laughing about leaving his wife destitute, perhaps simply by the sheer scope of his fraud. He owed $8.3 million in restitution and fines, money that would be garnished from any income he might earn for the rest of his life. Vanessa Cole had testified at his trial, her immunity agreement holding firm, and the last Betty had heard, she'd moved to Portland and changed her name, trying to build a life away from the wreckage. Betty sat in her new apartment in Hyde Park, smaller than the mansion by several thousand square feet but filled with light and entirely hers. The place was modest but comfortable, decorated with intention rather than the sterile perfection of hired designers. Her father sat across from her at the small dining table, her brother David perched on the arm of the couch, both of them watching as she held the envelope from Northwestern Law School. She'd sold the mansion within 2 months of Ricardo's conviction, liquidating the marble countertops and soaring ceilings and infinity pool that had never felt like home anyway. Half the proceeds had gone into a trust for her future. The other half she'd donated to 3 organizations that provided financial literacy programs for women, particularly women leaving abusive or controlling marriages. The donation had been made quietly, anonymously, but word had gotten out anyway. She'd received letters, dozens of them, from women thanking her for giving them resources to escape situations they thought were inescapable. The acceptance letter sat on the table in front of her, the Northwestern Law School seal embossed at the top. She'd been admitted to their evening program, which would let her work part-time while completing her degree. It would take 4 years instead of 3, but she had time now. She had freedom now. She had herself back. Marcus Harrison reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand, his eyes bright with pride that made Betty's throat tighten. You know this is just the beginning, right? Law school is brutal. The work never stops. You'll question why you're doing this about 100 times in the first semester alone. Betty smiled, really smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it hadn't for years. I've already survived the hard part, Dad. I think I can handle some case law and late-night studying. David laughed from the couch. She sat in a courtroom and watched her husband get arrested for federal crimes while staying completely calm. I think she can handle Professor Morrison's contracts exam. Marcus stood up, walked around the table, and kissed the top of Betty's head. Now the real work begins. Betty's story didn't end with revenge. It ended with reclamation. She took back her name, her future, and her power. But here's the thing. Stories like this don't just entertain us. They remind us that justice isn't always immediate, but it's worth fighting for. That preparation and patience can dismantle even the most arrogant predator. That family, evidence, and timing can turn the tables when everyone thinks you're powerless. If this story made you feel something, if you felt that satisfaction when the courtroom doors opened, if you held your breath during the evidence reveal, if you wanted to stand up and cheer when Ricardo got exactly what he deserved, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Because we're building a community here of people who believe in justice, who love seeing the underestimated rise up, and who know that the best stories are the ones where truth wins. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment? Was it Marcus Harrison's entrance, David's evidence presentation, Vanessa's betrayal, or that moment when the judge had to apologize? I read every single comment, and your insights make these stories even richer. And if you know someone who needs to hear Betty's story today, someone who feels powerless, someone who's been underestimated, someone who's quietly gathering their strength, share this video with them. Let them know that their moment is coming too. Hit that like button if you believe that dignity, preparation, and family can defeat arrogance every single time. Betty Harrison is starting law school now. Her real work is just beginning. And so is ours. I'll see you in the next story, where once again, we'll watch someone who was counted out prove everyone wrong. Subscribe, comment, share, because these stories matter.